The transport was shaking, not from turbulence, from the weight. 47 Soviet officers packed into a fuselage designed for 30, standing because there weren't enough seats, holding onto cargo straps because there weren't enough handholds. The smell was overwhelming. Sweat, tobacco, engine oil, and fear compressed into a metal tube flying 3,000 feet above Ukrainian farmland. Colonel Dmitry Sokolov felt the aircraft bank left and grabbed the strap tighter. His knuckles were white. Not from the motion, from the knowledge that this flight should never have been authorized. The weather forecast called for low visibility. The route passed through contested airspace. The identification protocols were unclear because the front lines had shifted twice in the past week and nobody had updated the recognition codes. The pilot was 22 years old. Sokolov had seen him during boarding, a lieutenant who looked like he should be studying mathematics at university instead of flying a PS-84 transport through airspace where German fighters operated daily. The co-pilot looked even younger. They had maybe 400 hours combined experience, most of it flying supply runs to forward bases, none of it flying formations of multiple transports carrying senior officers who represented months of training and years of combat experience. Someone near the front of the fuselage was vomiting. The sound triggered sympathetic responses from two other passengers. The aircraft banked again, harder this time, and Sokolov heard metal groaning in ways that metal shouldn't groan. The PS-84 was a license-built Douglas DC-3, reliable in American hands, questionable in Soviet hands, where maintenance schedules were suggestions, and spare parts were distributed based on political connections rather than operational necessity. Through the small window, Sokolov could see the other transports. 5 aircraft total, flying in loose formation that would have horrified any instructor at flight school. The spacing was too wide for mutual defense, too close for independent maneuvering. The formation looked like what it was: improvised response to an urgent order from someone who understood politics better than aviation. The order had come from front headquarters 36 hours ago. All senior officers currently at the training facility in Kursk were to report immediately to Kharkov for planning sessions regarding the upcoming offensive. Transport would be provided. Departure at dawn. No exceptions. The order was signed by a general whose name Sokolov recognized as someone who had survived the purges by never questioning orders and never admitting mistakes. Sokolov had questioned the order. Quietly, to his immediate superior, Colonel Belov, who was standing 3 feet away, holding the same cargo strap and wearing the same expression of controlled anxiety. Belov had said what Sokolov expected. Orders were orders. Questioning orders was dangerous, and flying to Kharkov was probably safer than explaining to front headquarters why you refused to fly to Kharkov. The mathematics of the situation were simple and terrible. The training facility held approximately 150 senior officers, battalion commanders, regimental commanders, staff officers who understood logistics and communications and artillery coordination. These were officers who had survived the catastrophic defeats of 1941, the grinding warfare of 1942, and the slow turn of momentum in early 1943. They represented institutional knowledge that couldn't be replaced quickly because the Soviet system had killed most of the experienced officers in the purges and was now desperately trying to rebuild competence while simultaneously fighting the largest land war in human history. Putting 150 irreplaceable officers on 5 unreliable transports and flying them through contested airspace without fighter escort was the kind of decision that made sense in a system where individual lives mattered less than following orders, and where admitting that an order was stupid could get you shot faster than German bullets. The aircraft dropped suddenly, not mechanical failure, just turbulence, but several officers lost their grip on the straps and fell into each other. Someone cursed in language that would have earned punishment in any normal military environment, but here earned nothing but agreement. The pilot corrected, the aircraft leveled, and everyone grabbed whatever they could reach and held on with renewed determination. Sokolov checked his watch. 28 minutes since takeoff. The flight to Kharkov should take 90 minutes total. They were approximately 1/3 complete. 2/3 remaining. 62 minutes of flying through airspace where German reconnaissance aircraft operated freely, and Soviet air defences shot first and identified targets afterward because mistakes were forgiven, but letting German bombers through was not. Through the window, Sokolov saw smoke on the horizon. Black smoke. That could mean anything. Burning village, destroyed convoy, crashed aircraft, deliberate smokescreen. The front lines were fluid. Yesterday's rear area was today's contested zone. The maps showed Kharkov as securely held Soviet territory. The maps were drawn by cartographers in Moscow who received information that was days old and politically filtered before publication. The aircraft banked right. Sharp turn, steep enough that officers on the left side were pushed against the fuselage wall. The engine pitch changed. Power reduction. Beginning descent. Too early. Kharkov was still 40 minutes away at current speed and altitude. Descending now meant either the pilot was lost or something had gone wrong. Colonel Belov leaned close to Sokolov and shouted over the engine noise, "We're turning back." Sokolov looked out the window. The other transports were still in formation, still heading toward Kharkov. His aircraft was breaking formation, turning back toward Kursk. That was wrong. Breaking formation without radio communication, without visual signals, without any indication of emergency, was violation of every protocol. Either the pilot was having mechanical problems or he had decided independently to abort the mission. Both options were terrifying. Mechanical problems at 3,000 feet with 47 passengers and no parachutes. Independent decision-making by a 22-year-old lieutenant who would be shot if he survived the landing. The nose dropped. Steep descent. Too steep. The engine sound changed again, not mechanical failure, but power settings that indicated rapid descent. Officers in the fuselage were shouting questions that nobody could answer. The aircraft was descending fast enough that ears were popping from pressure changes. Sokolov saw ground through the window. Fields, a road, buildings in the distance. The aircraft was descending toward an emergency landing in terrain that might or might not be suitable for landing a fully loaded transport. The pilot was either having serious mechanical problems or had made a decision that would require explanation that Sokolov couldn't imagine being accepted by any Soviet authority. The landing gear extended, hydraulics groaning. The gear indicator lights that Sokolov couldn't see from the passenger compartment, but knew from his own pilot training would be showing 3 green if everything was working correctly. The aircraft leveled slightly, still descending but at reduced rate. Then the anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The sound was distinctive, rapid thumping that came from outside the aircraft, from the ground, from Soviet anti-aircraft positions that were doing exactly what they were supposed to do when unidentified aircraft appeared at low altitude near Soviet installations. The first burst missed. Sokolov saw tracer rounds arc past the window, orange streaks moving impossibly fast. The pilot tried to climb. Full power, nose up, desperate attempt to gain altitude and get out of the engagement envelope of guns that could fire 400 rounds per minute and didn't care whether the target was German or Soviet. The aircraft was too heavy. Climb rate was maybe 300 feet per minute, which meant the guns had 30 seconds to destroy the aircraft before it climbed out of effective range. The second burst didn't miss. Sokolov heard impacts, metal striking metal, the distinctive sound of projectiles penetrating aluminum skin. The aircraft shuddered. Something in the fuselage made a sound like tearing cloth amplified 1,000 times. An officer near the front screamed. The third burst hit the left engine. Sokolov saw it through the window, metal fragments erupting from the engine cowling, black smoke pouring out, the propeller slowing from a blur to visible individual blades. The pilot feathered the propeller, stopped it from windmilling and creating drag, but the aircraft was now flying on one engine while carrying 47 passengers and trying to climb out of range of guns that were still firing. The fourth burst hit the fuselage. Multiple impacts. The sound was like being inside a drum that someone was striking with hammers. The screaming increased. Sokolov looked back and saw blood. An officer was down, 3 others were crouching over him, and the fuselage wall had holes that let in freezing air and let out anything that wasn't secured. The pilot gave up trying to climb. The nose dropped, the aircraft went into a dive that was either controlled descent or beginning of uncontrolled crash. Through the window, Sokolov saw the ground approaching too fast. The pilot was trying to land, attempting controlled crash in terrain that might allow survival. The landing gear was still extended. That was either good preparation or failure to retract. The aircraft was descending at maybe 2,000 feet per minute, which was 4 times the normal descent rate. The ground was coming up fast. Field, trees, another field, trees again. The pilot was aiming for the second field. They hit hard. The landing gear collapsed immediately. The fuselage scraped across frozen ground, tearing metal and throwing everyone forward against whoever was in front of them. The left wing hit something, tree, building, boulder, and the aircraft spun 90 degrees. The tail section separated. The fuselage kept sliding, slower now, and finally stopped. Sokolov was alive. He could move his arms and legs. His face hurt. He had hit someone's shoulder during impact, but nothing felt broken. Around him were sounds that he would remember for the rest of his life. Screaming, moaning, someone calling for medic, someone praying in Ukrainian, and underneath it all the hiss of escaping fuel and the creak of damaged metal settling. The fuselage was tilted at 20 degrees. The rear section where the tail had been was open to sky. Cold air was rushing in. Smoke was coming from somewhere forward, either the damaged engine or electrical fire or fuel that had found an ignition source. Fire was the worst outcome. Everyone knew aircraft crashed. Not everyone knew how fast aircraft burned once fire started. Colonel Belov was unconscious. Sokolov checked his pulse. Steady, breathing normal, probably concussion. 3 other officers nearby were helping injured. Someone was organizing evacuation through the rear where the fuselage had separated. The organization was instinctive. These were combat officers who had trained for crisis situations, and aircraft crashes were just another crisis that required immediate action despite shock and injury. Sokolov moved toward the rear. His left leg wasn't working properly. Sprained ankle, maybe broken. Pain would provide details later. He reached the separation point and looked out. The tail section was 50 meters away, lying on its side. Between the 2 sections were pieces of aircraft and pieces of cargo, and at least 3 bodies that weren't moving. The field was empty. No buildings visible. Trees on 3 sides. Smoke from the crashed aircraft would be visible for kilometers. That smoke would attract attention. Soviet attention or German attention, depending on whether the crash site was behind Soviet lines or behind German lines, or in the contested zone where lines existed only on maps drawn by optimistic cartographers. Officers were evacuating through the rear. Someone was helping Colonel Belov. Someone else was carrying an injured officer who was missing part of his left arm. The organization was breaking down. Initial training was giving way to shock and pain, and realization that they had survived aircraft crash only to be stranded in unknown territory, with unknown number of injured and unknown proximity to enemy forces. Sokolov counted survivors. 47 had boarded. He counted 31 moving. That meant 16 dead or too injured to evacuate independently. The fuselage was smoking more heavily now. The smell of burning electrical insulation was mixing with fuel smell. Fire was inevitable. The question was whether they could evacuate everyone before fire reached the fuel tanks. 4 officers went back into the fuselage. They emerged carrying 2 injured, went back, emerged with 1 more, went back. The smoke was thicker now, darker. They emerged coughing, supporting each other, saying there were bodies in the forward section but fire was too intense to reach them. The fuel tanks exploded. Not Hollywood explosion, real explosion, which was worse. Overpressure wave that knocked everyone down. Fireball that consumed the forward third of the fuselage in seconds. Heat that Sokolov could feel from 50 meters away. The 4 officers who had just evacuated were thrown flat by the blast wave. One didn't get up. Sokolov did triage. Combat experience translated directly to crash survival. Critical injuries first. Stop bleeding. Treat shock. Move the wounded away from burning wreckage. Use whatever materials were available. Torn uniforms for bandages, cargo straps for tourniquets, snow for cooling burns. The count stabilized. 30 survivors capable of walking. 8 wounded requiring assistance to move. 12 dead. The mathematics were horrifying but clear. 25% casualties from an incident that should never have happened, caused by Soviet anti-aircraft guns firing on Soviet aircraft in Soviet territory, because the identification protocols had failed or been ignored or never existed. Colonel Belov regained consciousness. His first words were a question. Where are we? Sokolov said he didn't know. Belov's second words were a statement. We need to move before Germans arrive. Sokolov agreed. The fire was visible for kilometers. The explosion would have been audible for 10 kilometers. Someone would investigate. Ideally, Soviet forces, possibly German forces. Definitely someone who would ask questions about why a Soviet transport aircraft had crashed behind what should be Soviet lines. They organized movement, walking wounded in front, critical wounded on improvised stretchers made from cargo straps and uniform jackets, able-bodied officers carrying the stretchers in rotation, direction of movement, east. Rationale, east was away from the German advance. East should lead to Soviet positions eventually. The movement was slow, 200 meters in the first 30 minutes. The stretcher bearers were already exhausted, carrying injured men across frozen fields in below freezing temperature while recovering from aircraft crash. Sokolov calculated distance and capability and realized they would be lucky to cover 5 kilometers before dark. 5 kilometers might not be enough to reach Soviet positions. Sound of engines. Everyone stopped. Everyone listened. The sound was coming from the west. Vehicles, multiple vehicles. The sound grew louder. Through the trees, Sokolov saw movement. Trucks, military trucks with markings he couldn't identify at this distance. Soviet or German was a coin flip with life or death stakes. Remaining hidden meant watching the critical wounded die from exposure and untreated injuries. Revealing position meant potential rescue or potential capture. Sokolov made the decision that he would defend later if he survived. He stepped into the open and waved. The truck stopped. Soldiers dismounted. Soviet soldiers. The uniforms were unmistakable at close range. Relief lasted approximately 5 seconds, until the soldiers raised their weapons. A captain approached, young, maybe 25. He looked at the crashed aircraft survivors and said, "You are under arrest. Explain why you destroyed Soviet aircraft." The absurdity of the statement took several seconds to process. They hadn't destroyed the aircraft. Soviet anti-aircraft guns had destroyed the aircraft. But explaining that to a captain who was clearly following orders and probably didn't care about explanations was likely to end badly. Colonel Bailov stood. He was unsteady but conscious, and still technically senior officer present. He said, "I am Colonel Bailov, 15th Guards Rifle Division. This aircraft was shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. We require immediate medical assistance for wounded and transport to Kharkov." The captain said, "You will be transported to Kharkov for interrogation. NKVD will determine responsibility." NKVD, the Soviet security apparatus that specialized in finding enemies of the state, regardless of whether enemies actually existed. Being handed to NKVD meant interrogation that assumed guilt and worked backward to find evidence. Officers who had survived German attacks, aircraft crashes, and friendly fire were now facing the possibility of being shot by their own side for the crime of surviving. The soldiers loaded survivors onto trucks with efficiency that suggested experience in transporting prisoners. The wounded were handled roughly because gentleness wasn't part of the procedure. Sokolov helped load stretchers and tried not to think about what awaited them in Kharkov. The drive took 4 hours. 4 hours of sitting in truck beds with guards who wouldn't answer questions and wouldn't allow conversation. 4 hours of watching the landscape and trying to identify whether they were being transported to headquarters or to prison. The distinction mattered because one meant investigation and the other meant assumption of guilt. Kharkov appeared at dusk. The city was damaged. Evidence of recent combat, destroyed buildings, abandoned vehicles. The trucks bypassed the main roads and took back streets to a compound that Sokolov recognized as NKVD facility, not headquarters, prison. The trucks stopped inside a walled courtyard. The guards ordered everyone out. The wounded were separated first. Stretchers carried into a building that might be medical facility or might be interrogation center. The walking wounded were directed to a second building. Sokolov and 15 other officers who were largely uninjured were taken to a third building and placed in rooms that were clearly cells. The cell was 3 meters by 4 meters. Concrete floor. Metal bed frame with no mattress. Bucket in the corner. Small window with bars. Sokolov had seen similar facilities during his service. These were holding cells for political prisoners awaiting interrogation. The fact that they were being held in political prisoner facilities rather than military facilities answered several questions about what would happen next. The interrogation began after midnight. Sokolov was taken from the cell by 2 guards who said nothing and responded to no questions. He was brought to a room with a table, 2 chairs, and a light bulb that hung from the ceiling and provided exactly enough illumination to make everything visible without making anything clear. The interrogator was NKVD Major. His name was never provided. He read from a file and asked questions. The questions followed a pattern that Sokolov recognized from training. Establish timeline, identify inconsistencies, build case for predetermined conclusion. You were aboard transport aircraft that was destroyed. Yes? The aircraft was shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft defenses. Yes? Why did Soviet defenses shoot down Soviet aircraft? The question assumed answer that Sokolov couldn't provide without either lying or implicating the pilot who was probably dead. He said, "The aircraft broke formation and descended rapidly. The anti-aircraft crews likely interpreted this as hostile action." Why did the aircraft break formation? I don't know. I was passenger, not crew. You are pilot qualified. You understand aircraft operations. Yes? Then explain why the pilot broke formation. The interrogation continued for 6 hours. The major asked the same questions in different arrangements. Sokolov provided the same answers. The major's expression never changed. He was following procedure. Establish that the incident occurred, identify someone to blame, build documentation that would satisfy superiors who demanded explanations for embarrassing failures. The truth was simple. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses had shot down Soviet aircraft because the identification protocols failed and the gun crews did what they were trained to do when unidentified aircraft appeared at low altitude. The truth was unacceptable because it implied systemic failure rather than individual mistake. Sokolov was returned to his cell at dawn. No food had been provided, no water. The cell was cold enough that his breath was visible. He sat on the metal bed frame and tried to calculate survival probability. If NKVD decided to blame the incident on sabotage or cowardice or failure to follow protocols, execution was likely. If they decided to blame mechanical failure or bad weather, imprisonment was likely. If they decided to investigate honestly, which was unlikely, someone at front headquarters would have to explain why they ordered 150 senior officers onto 5 transports without fighter escort or proper coordination with air defense forces. The other survivors were interrogated in sequence. Sokolov heard them being taken and returned. Some returned quickly. Some took hours. One didn't return at all. Whether that meant execution or transfer to another facility was impossible to determine. 3 days passed. Minimal food. No information. The cell remained cold. Sokolov developed a cough that suggested the beginnings of pneumonia. Medical care was not provided because providing medical care to potential enemies of the state was not protocol. On the 4th day, the cell door opened. Not interrogation, release. The guard said, "You are transferred to military hospital for treatment of injuries sustained in aircraft accident. You will report to your unit after medical discharge." The change was so abrupt that Sokolov didn't process it immediately. Release meant someone at higher authority had decided that prosecuting the survivors was worse publicity than quietly treating them and returning them to service. The incident would be classified. The survivors would be ordered not to discuss it. The official record would say nothing about Soviet guns shooting down Soviet aircraft because official records didn't acknowledge mistakes that could undermine confidence in the system. The military hospital was overcrowded. Every bed held wounded soldiers from the ongoing operations around Kharkov. Sokolov was treated for sprained ankle, minor burns, and developing pneumonia. The treatment was adequate but not enthusiastic. Medical staff were overworked and undersupplied and not particularly interested in officers who had survived aircraft crashes while soldiers were dying from wounds sustained fighting Germans. Colonel Bailov was in the same hospital. He had concussion and 3 broken ribs. He told Sokolov what he had learned from a sympathetic nurse. The other 4 transports in the formation had completed the flight successfully. 120 officers had arrived safely in Kharkov. 47 had been aboard Sokolov's aircraft. 12 had died in the crash. 35 had survived. 2 had died during interrogation, 1 from untreated injuries, 1 from reasons that weren't specified. 33 survivors remained. All had been ordered not to discuss the incident. All had been threatened with immediate execution if they violated the secrecy order. The official investigation concluded that mechanical failure caused the crash. The pilot was posthumously blamed for failure to maintain formation discipline. The anti-aircraft crews were commended for vigilance in shooting down what they reasonably believed to be hostile aircraft. No mention was made of identification protocol failures. No mention was made of the decision to transport senior officers without proper escort or coordination. No mention was made of the NKVD interrogations or the deaths that occurred in custody. Sokolov was discharged from hospital after 2 weeks. He returned to the training facility in Kursk. The facility had been reorganized. New commanders had been appointed. The officers who had survived the crash were distributed to different units to avoid concentration of personnel who shared knowledge of embarrassing incident. The war continued. The Kharkov region changed hands multiple times during the following months. The crash site was probably captured by German forces, then recaptured by Soviet forces. The aircraft wreckage was probably salvaged for metal. The bodies of the 12 officers who died in the crash were probably buried by whoever controlled the territory at the time. Sokolov survived the war. He was promoted to general officer rank. He commanded a rifle division during the final push into Germany. He was decorated for valor and competence. He never spoke publicly about the crash. The incident didn't appear in his official military record. The Soviet system preferred victories to failures, and incidents that involved Soviet forces killing Soviet personnel were classified failures that ceased to exist in official histories. After the war, Sokolov retired from military service. He worked as an instructor at a military academy, teaching tactics and operations to new generations of officers. He sometimes thought about the crash. He sometimes wondered if other survivors thought about it. He never asked, because asking was dangerous even decades after the incident. The Soviet archives contain documentation of the incident, investigation reports, interrogation transcripts, orders classifying the incident as state secret, orders prohibiting discussion of the incident. The archives were sealed. Researchers who studied Soviet military history during World War II occasionally found references to unexplained losses of transport aircraft in early 1943, but the details remained classified. After the Soviet Union collapsed, some archives were opened. Researchers found documentation of the incident. The reports confirmed what survivors had known. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses had shot down 5 Soviet transport aircraft near Kharkov in March of 1943. The first aircraft crashed with total loss of crew and passengers. The remaining 4 transports continued to destination without realizing one aircraft was missing until they landed. The reports provided numbers: 47 officers killed in the crash and subsequent deaths. The reports provided explanations: mechanical failure cited as primary cause, pilot error cited as contributing factor. Anti-aircraft crews commended for following engagement protocols. The reports did not provide accountability. No one was disciplined for ordering the flights without proper coordination. No one was disciplined for the identification protocol failures. No one was disciplined for the interrogations that killed 2 survivors. The incident was one of many similar incidents during the war. Soviet forces shot down Soviet aircraft regularly because the identification systems were inadequate, and gun crews were trained to engage first and verify later. The official statistics were never released, but historians estimate that friendly fire accounted for approximately 5% of Soviet aircraft losses during the war. 5% was acceptable cost in a system that measured success by territory gained and enemies killed, rather than by efficiency or care for personnel. Sokolov died in 1978. His obituary mentioned his military service and his teaching career. It did not mention the crash. His family knew he had been in an aircraft accident during the war. They didn't know the details because he never discussed the details. The incident was classified when it occurred and remained classified throughout his lifetime. The crash site was located by researchers in the 1990s. The wreckage had been removed decades earlier, but the impact crater remained visible in aerial photographs. Local residents remembered hearing about a Soviet aircraft crash during the war, but had been told not to discuss it. Some residents remembered soldiers removing bodies. No one remembered where the bodies were buried. The 12 officers who died in the crash were eventually identified from military records. Their names appeared on memorial walls commemorating Soviet casualties during the war. The memorial inscriptions said they died in combat operations near Kharkov in March 1943. The inscriptions did not specify that they died when Soviet guns shot down their aircraft. The inscriptions did not mention that they were traveling to a planning conference that accomplished nothing because the offensive they were supposed to plan was delayed by German counterattacks. The story of the crash became a footnote in histories of Soviet military operations during World War II. Historians who specialized in Soviet military history knew about the incident. General audiences did not. The incident wasn't dramatic enough for popular histories. No heroes emerged from the crash. No tactical innovations resulted from the incident. It was simply another example of the chaos and dysfunction that characterized Soviet operations during the war. Operations that succeeded despite mistakes rather than because of competence. The survivors who lived long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse sometimes discussed the incident with researchers. Their accounts were consistent. The aircraft was shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. The crash was survivable. The interrogations were terrifying. The official explanation was a lie. The system preferred lies to accountability. The incident raised questions that were never officially answered. Why were senior officers transported without fighter escort? Why were identification protocols inadequate? Why were anti-aircraft crews not informed that friendly aircraft would be operating in the area? Why were survivors interrogated as potential enemies rather than treated as casualties? Why were 2 survivors allowed to die in custody? Why was the incident classified as state secret rather than investigated as systemic failure? The answers existed in the logic of the Soviet system. The system valued following orders over questioning orders. The system valued appearance of competence over admission of mistakes. The system valued secrecy over accountability. The system survived by preventing information from reaching levels where it could force changes to the system. Sokolov understood this. He understood it during the crash. He understood it during the interrogation. He understood it during his decades of service and teaching. He understood that the system had shot down his aircraft just as surely as the anti-aircraft guns had fired the shells. The guns were merely mechanical implementation of systemic dysfunction. The incident was forgotten by everyone except those who experienced it. The 12 dead officers became statistics. The 33 survivors became career officers who carried the memory privately and spoke about it never. The system continued operating in the same manner that had caused the incident because the system was incapable of learning from mistakes that it refused to acknowledge. The planning conference that the officers were travelling to was postponed, then cancelled, then held 3 weeks later with different officers from different units. The offensive that was supposed to be planned was delayed by German counterattacks that captured Kharkov yet again in mid-March. The front lines that had seemed stable when the transport flights were ordered became fluid combat zones, where neither side controlled territory long enough to establish secure positions. The 5 transport aircraft represented approximately 8% of available transport capacity for the entire front. Losing 1 aircraft meant losing 8% of capability to move personnel and critical supplies. The front commander received reports about the loss. He ordered investigation. The investigation determined that mechanical failure was responsible. The front commander accepted this explanation because questioning it would require admitting that his order to transport officers without proper coordination had contributed to the disaster. The families of the 12 dead officers received telegrams. The telegrams used standard language about death in service to the motherland and gratitude for sacrifice. The telegrams did not specify how the officers died. Some families assumed combat casualties. Some families assumed accidents. None were told that Soviet guns had killed their husbands, fathers, sons, or brothers. The anti-aircraft battalion that fired on the transport received commendation for vigilance. The battalion commander was promoted. The gun crews received extra rations as reward for successful engagement. Nobody informed them that their successful engagement had killed Soviet officers. The information would have served no purpose except to undermine morale and create questions about identification protocols that headquarters preferred not to answer. The pilot who broke formation and attempted emergency landing was posthumously blamed for the incident. His file was annotated with comments about failure to maintain formation discipline and unauthorized deviation from flight plan. His family received the same telegram as families of the dead passengers. His mother wrote letters to military authorities requesting clarification about how her son died. The letters were answered with statements about classified military operations and references to state secrets that could not be discussed. Colonel Belov returned to combat duty 3 months after the crash. He commanded a rifle regiment during the summer offensive operations. He was wounded twice, once by German artillery, once by German sniper. He survived both wounds and the war. He never spoke about the crash except once, late in life, when he told his grandson a story about surviving aircraft crash during the war. The grandson remembered the story but didn't understand the significance. Belov died before the archives were opened and never knew that researchers would eventually document what he had experienced. The 33 survivors were scattered across different units. Some survived the war, some died in combat, some died in accidents. One was executed in 1944 for cowardice, unrelated to the crash, but related to the same systemic dysfunction that valued punishment over investigation. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, only 7 survivors remained alive. 3 agreed to speak with researchers. 4 refused to discuss the incident even after declassification. The 3 survivors who spoke provided details that matched the archival documentation. They described the crash sequence. They described the interrogations. They described the fear that speaking about the incident would result in arrest. One survivor, a former major named Volkov, who had been severely burned in the crash, said the interrogation was worse than the crash because the crash was accident, but the interrogation was intentional cruelty. Volkov described the interrogator asking the same questions repeatedly for 6 hours, describing the cell where he spent 3 days without adequate food or medical care, describing the moment when he was released and told never to speak about what happened. He said he had nightmares about the interrogation for decades. He said the physical scars from the burns faded, but the psychological scars from believing his own government might execute him for surviving an accident never fully healed. The second survivor who spoke, retired general named Petrov, who had been a captain at the time of the crash, focused on the systemic failures. He explained that the Soviet military operated on assumption that obedience was more important than competence. Orders were followed regardless of whether orders made tactical sense. Junior officers who questioned orders were punished. Senior officers who admitted mistakes were replaced. The system rewarded appearance of success and punished admission of failure. Petrov said the crash was a predictable consequence of systemic dysfunction. Transport aircraft were flying without proper coordination with air defense forces because coordination required communication between different command structures, and Soviet system discouraged horizontal communication. Each vertical command structure reported to Moscow and received orders from Moscow. Lateral coordination between structures required Moscow's approval. Getting Moscow's approval required time and paperwork and political capital that commanders preferred to spend on other priorities. The result was that transport aircraft flew through airspace defended by anti-aircraft units that had not been informed that friendly aircraft would be operating in the area. The anti-aircraft units followed their protocols. Engage unidentified aircraft immediately. The protocols were designed for situations where most unidentified aircraft were German. The protocols did not account for possibility that unidentified aircraft might be Soviet. The third survivor who spoke, former lieutenant colonel named Rusanov, focused on the human cost. He described helping evacuate wounded from burning aircraft, carrying stretchers across frozen fields while recovering from his own injuries. Watching 2 fellow officers die during interrogation because NKVD prioritized finding culprits over treating wounded. He said the crash killed 12 officers immediately and 2 more within days and traumatized the remaining survivors for life. Rusanov said he spent decades wondering whether he should have done something differently, should have insisted on proper identification protocols before boarding, should have refused the flight orders despite consequences for insubordination, should have helped more wounded during evacuation. The wondering accomplished nothing except to provide focus for guilt that had nowhere else to go. The psychological impact of the incident extended beyond the immediate survivors. The families of the dead officers lived with incomplete information about how their loved ones died. The mothers and wives and children who received telegrams about death in service knew something was being withheld but couldn't know what. Some families investigated privately. Some accepted official explanations. All lived with uncertainty that was worse than truth because imagination creates horrors worse than reality. The anti-aircraft crews who fired on the transport never knew they had killed Soviet officers. If they had known, some would have been traumatized by the knowledge. Some would have rationalized it as following orders. Some would have developed guilt that manifested as post-traumatic stress that Soviet medical system didn't recognize or treat, because acknowledging psychological trauma would require acknowledging that Soviet soldiers experienced psychological trauma. The systemic impact was invisible. The incident didn't change protocols. Nobody was disciplined for the coordination failures. No new procedures were implemented to prevent similar incidents. The system continued operating exactly as before because the system was incapable of learning from mistakes that were classified as state secrets. Other similar incidents occurred throughout the war. Soviet aircraft were shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft defenses in 1941 when the German invasion created chaos and panic. In 1942, when the front lines were fluid and identification systems were overwhelmed. In 1943, when the tide was turning, but coordination was still inadequate. In 1944, when Soviet forces were advancing but moving faster than communication could keep pace. In 1945, when victory was certain, but mistakes were still being made. The statistics were never compiled into a single report. Each incident was investigated separately. Each investigation concluded with explanations that avoided systemic critique: mechanical failure, pilot error, weather conditions, enemy action. Any explanation except systemic dysfunction that would require admitting the system was dysfunctional. Historians who studied Soviet military operations estimated that friendly fire casualties represented between 3 and 7% of total Soviet losses during the war. The range was large because documentation was incomplete and inconsistent. Some friendly fire incidents were documented as combat casualties. Some were documented as accidents. Some were not documented at all because acknowledging them would have required explanations that commanders preferred not to provide. The human cost was measured in thousands. Thousands of Soviet soldiers killed by Soviet fire. Thousands of families who received misleading information about how their loved ones died. Thousands of survivors who carried guilt and trauma and secrets that couldn't be spoken. The cost was invisible in official histories that focused on victories and heroism and sacrifice in service to the motherland. The Kharkov incident was not unique. It was representative. It showed how systems that prioritize control over competence create conditions where accidents become inevitable and accountability becomes impossible. It showed how secrecy protects systems rather than people. It showed how official narratives erase inconvenient truths and replace them with explanations that serve political purposes rather than historical accuracy. The incident was forgotten because the system needed it to be forgotten. Remembering would require admitting mistakes. Admitting mistakes would require changing systems. Changing systems would require acknowledging that the system was flawed. Acknowledging that the system was flawed would undermine the foundation of Soviet authority, which claimed infallibility and competence and inevitable victory. The survivors who remained silent did so, not from loyalty to the system, but from understanding that speaking would accomplish nothing except to endanger themselves. The system had already demonstrated willingness to blame survivors for surviving. Speaking about the incident after being ordered to remain silent would provide excuse for punishment. Silence was survival strategy in system where survival required avoiding attention from authorities who could destroy lives on suspicion alone. The families who didn't receive full truth learned to live with incomplete information. Some constructed narratives that explained the gaps. Some accepted that certain questions had no answers. Some passed down family stories that contained fragments of truth mixed with speculation and hope. The stories preserved memory even when official records were sealed. The historical record that eventually emerged from opened archives told part of the story. Documents provided facts, dates, locations, casualties, investigation conclusions. Documents could not convey the experience of surviving crash and interrogation, could not convey the fear of being blamed by your own side for being attacked by your own side, could not convey the decades of wondering whether speaking the truth was worth the risk. The complete story required combining archival documents with survivor testimony with analysis of systemic dysfunction. The combination revealed an incident that was simultaneously unique and typical. Unique in its specific details: the officers, the aircraft, the location, the circumstances. Typical in its causes and consequences: coordination failures, inadequate protocols, blame assignment rather than problem solving, classification rather than accountability. The lesson of the incident was that systems designed to prevent admission of failure will continue to generate failures. The Soviet military system during World War II was such a system. It achieved victory through massive resource deployment and willingness to accept catastrophic casualties. It succeeded despite systemic dysfunction rather than because of systemic competence. The incident near Kharkov was one example among thousands of how dysfunction manifested and was suppressed. The legacy of the incident exists in archives that researchers consult when studying Soviet military history. Exists in memorial walls that list names without explaining how those named died. Exists in family stories passed down through generations with varying degrees of accuracy. Exists in academic papers that analyze friendly fire casualties and systemic failures. Exists in the absence of public commemoration or official acknowledgement. The 12 officers who died deserve better legacy than classification and obfuscation. They died serving their country in war that required their service. They died not from enemy action, but from systemic failures that their country refused to acknowledge or correct. Their deaths should have prompted investigation that prevented future incidents. Instead, their deaths were classified, and the system that killed them continued operating unchanged. That is the complete story of what happened near Kharkov in March of 1943, when Soviet forces shot down Soviet aircraft carrying Soviet officers to a planning conference that never occurred. The story is documented in archives that were sealed for 50 years. The story is remembered by descendants of survivors who heard fragments of truth through family stories that were never spoken above whisper. The story is a reminder that wars kill soldiers through enemy action and through friendly fire and through systemic dysfunction that is more lethal than both. The story is a reminder that truth suppressed for political convenience eventually emerges, but emerges too late for accountability or justice or anything except historical record.